Perfect. All right. Well, Ivana, do you want to kick us off with the weed question? Ivana's our weed guru, so then I'll jump in for sort of the repair aspect for the weeds.
Yeah. So, Alvin, we had a very tough weed year this year. It was something about the weather, is what I'm thinking. Just a ton of more weeds than usual. I saw a lot more henbit, a lot more dandelions, everything like that. And this also kind of rolls into, I think, Sue's second question about just having to overseed regularly to keep those weeds out. Basically, that's going to be the best option for grasses that do have seed. So just making sure, as you see them, knowing when to treat them is always a good thing to do. So you don't really want to treat weeds when grass isn't actively growing as much, just because you'll get those bare spots in your lawn that are just another vector for new weeds to come through. So as far as weeds go, if it's something that's not spreading too readily, I'd recommend kind of just leaving it there for now. Making sure to mow and to bag your clippings is something very important. So if you have a ton of weeds that are flowering, you start to see a lot of clover flowers or dandelion flowers. Just making sure as you mow to bag those clippings, and I'll help remove those and keep those from spreading as much. But for any grasses that can be overseeded, we kind of missed the boat for a lot of grasses this year in the spring. This fall, I do recommend a very heavy overseeding. So that's going to be your tall fescues, fine fescue, basically any fescue, bluegrasses, ryegrasses, Bermuda grass can be seeded, centipede can be seeded, so can zoysia. So any grasses like that, I would recommend seeding those. For grasses that can't be seeded, something like a St. Augustine, in the fall, it's really going to be about encouraging it to repair itself. So doing things like top dressing, removing any dead plant material underneath them just to encourage the spread. If you want to kind of use the runners that you get in your St. Augustine, those long bits, kind of like vines, you can actually cut and propagate those. You can cut those, put them in an area that's bare, keep them very moist, pin them down with a paper clip or something like that, and they will help spread into those areas too. So as far as weeds go, I think the most ones that were popping up a lot this year were the clover and dandelion. I would focus more on the dandelions because they have those seed heads, they'll spread seeds everywhere. So make sure to mow them before they get to that point if you can. For clovers, I'm not as worried about because they do actually help the soil. This is usually the last weed I would look to treat in my lawn because they do end up being very beneficial. So I kind of just go through everything else first and then I'll work on the clover. And usually that's doing things like mowing a bit higher, using our dandelion doom, which is a selective herbicide, so it won't harm your grass. Just making sure that you're plucking the flowers if you can, things like that will help.
Perfect. And so the key focus here, essentially, from a long-term approach as well, right, is we've received a couple of questions here asking about this. Is it a good time to oversee? As Ivana noted, right now we're in that difficult time period from a repair perspective, but just as a general cast, and please feel free, if you have a specific grass or a specific location you want to ask about, please enter that in the Q&A box. But what would you say, Ivana, north of Carolinas, that's really the transition zone for the most part, typically expect to see a cool season grass, so looking to seed in spring and fall. Primarily difficult spring to seed though, due to, in the majority of the country, due to a fairly cool start in some areas and then jumping right into the warm summer conditions. And then for a warm season grass, so south of the Carolinas, typically, again, that's a pretty general or broad line to list, but that is when we could start to chat a bit more where we're not necessarily confined quite as much from or to the, let's say, 60 to 80 degree range for seeding, right? That's typically what we look at for a cool season grass. We could dip or jump up, what do you say, potentially up to 90, 95 or so for Bermuda, yeah. But definitely gets difficult. And with some of the other warm season grasses like centipede and zoysia, we could chat about seeding, but we also want to make sure we give them enough time to establish. And depending on your location, that can also affect timing as well. So short answer, yes, most likely not the best time to be repairing the lawn right now. So looking to essentially develop that plan for moving forward, right? And there was a question which we received asking, is it a good idea to overseed each year? Especially I would say for the cool season grasses, right? Some of these warm season grasses, we can focus a bit more on allowing them to spread naturally. Now, certainly exceptions there, but yes, since, and this is jumping right into another weed control question, since we don't offer a pre-emergent, right, or anything to actually inhibit seed germination, we do want to maintain that thick turf canopy. So if there are any thin areas, always a great option to be able to overseed regularly or each season per se.
Yeah, the target here is just to make the environment as great as possible for your grass, and just making sure it's thick enough, it's healthy enough, and things like that. You'll start to see reduced weed growth. Obviously, this year was an outlier with the amount of weeds, but this year I think my front yard maybe got 2, and it was the one that wasn't as affected by these temperatures. The backyard's a little bit different since we did have that warm, wet area for Texas. It did end up getting a fungus, so something that we're also going to chat about a little bit, but that will weaken it and allow for weed growth. So again, just making it as healthy as possible will help cut down on a lot of these weeds. And that goes for the soil too. So if you start to see some weeds, I know nut sedge can be a huge issue in Florida and Texas. That's usually a sign that the lawn is staying too moist for too long. So that might be a compaction issue or might be a watering issue. So things like that, different weeds come with, different causes. So always kind of focusing on what's there, why it's there, and how we can fix that.
Or my apologies, everybody, for jumping back and forth between slides here, but just want to make sure that we're able to reference some of the material here. So jumping into the next question that we have from Andrew asking about mowing height. This is a great question. Again, correlates pretty well with the with weed control, right? Trying to make sure that we have as long of a standard can't be a turf, if you will, to try to crop out some of those weeds. So for anybody looking to change their mowing height, right? Our biggest focus here is essentially be able to tackle this in chunks, if you will, right? So we want to make sure that we aren't stressing the grass by lowering the height too much. So removing less than 1/3 of the blade per cut and gradually working down to that height. So this is a great example. If you're unable to mow the grass before entering winter dormancy, for example, right? And it's a bit longer in the spring. We don't want to cut it right down to the normal height, right? That's going to be removing more than 1/3 of the blade. So we'd take that in chunks. Similar thought here. What I will say is if you have a bluegrass, I would like to keep it a little bit longer if possible, right? So you had noted sticking it right around that 3-inch mark. I would say for a cool season grass, I like to keep it a little bit longer. It's going to help, especially from a weed control perspective, right? Just minimizing essentially the amount of area for weeds able to take hold and mowing down closer to that 1-inch. Bermuda, we might be able to get away with it, a warm season grass, but with the cool season, I'm a bit concerned with essentially the amount of fertilizer and essentially what we're providing for the grass is going to stress the grass quite a bit, right? To keep it that short. So I would say try to keep it as long as possible.
Yeah, and if you are, wanting to cut it shorter, just keeping in mind that it will take a lot more effort. So, more frequent mowing, more frequent just walking out and weed spotting, that kind of thing. That's typically why we recommend, keeping it longer, keeping it healthier. But if you do want to get down there, just know that it's going to take just a little bit more work to keep it happy and healthy. And then yes. So we did talk about overseeding to control weeds too. I would say that fall is a really good time to do that for that purpose, just because it helps crowd out any sort of spring weeds that are going to try to come up. So fall overseeding is something, again, we highly recommend this year because spring was kind of a bust. So just making sure we seed very heavily in the fall to keep out those spring weeds.
Ivana, Dan's a great question about wild violet, right?
It does.
So creeping Charlie might be a little bit easier for us to get under control, right? But wild violet is certainly one which this is a really great question. So if Ivana, you would probably have a much better description for wild violet, but so
yeah, I can
aside
chat
from the
about it.
bulblets actually within the soil.
Yeah, so creeping Charlie, if you look at it, it's going to be more circular, the leaves are, and they're going to be serrated on the edges. Wild violet is usually going to be more of a heart shape, and the key detail is that some of the leaves will actually curl inward at the top. So if you see it looks like a heart, that part of the heart is going to be a little bit curled on some of those leaves. So that's a good way to identify them, and that does change our approach for the two different ones. So creeping Charlie would be something that just the regular overseeding, cutting grass, using dandelion doom, all of that stuff would be perfectly fine for. Wild violet would take just a little bit more work. Typically, it is one that is harder to treat with herbicides because it has that bulb, meaning that whatever you apply the leaves, it's just going to come back from the bulb over and over again. So doing things like just cutting your lawn a little bit longer to shade out those leaves, bagging any clippings to get rid of the flowers, and then If you can, if there's not a lot of them, I would highly recommend digging them up just because that bulb was going to be there a while. And it's going to be very hard to get rid of just with any sort of over the soil application.
All right. And question from Lee regarding how to handle burn spots in the grass. Great question. So one point which I did not bring up at the start of the webinar here is that we have hosted other webinars earlier this year, right? And so they have been uploaded to our YouTube channel. Strongly recommend checking those out. If this is your first webinar with us, we did host Preparing for a Better Summer Lawn webinars. It's a great webinar to take a look at. But these are the slides from this webinar. So specifically with areas which seem like they're burned out due to a lack of rain or a lack of water, it's really determining what we want to do with this area, right? So ideally, we could be looking to adjust the watering schedule if we are watering the lawn, right? To essentially maintain that healthy grass and bring it back from being almost that hay color, right? But the alternative is we can also consider essentially allowing the lawn to go gold, if you will, right? So during the summer months, where if there's a period where it's essentially very limited natural precipitation, it's very difficult to be able to maintain that watering schedule, and you feel it's best to essentially conserve your resources and follow up once the temps start to drop. That's certainly an option, right? And so what we look at would essentially be just maintain the grass crowns, make sure that the crowns are hydrated, right? It's typically, what do you say, about every week or two, maybe half an inch of water or so.
Yeah, I would say every week, half an inch, just in case.
Okay. And then once the temps start to drop back, that grass is going to essentially exit that summer dormancy or that gold state, and we'll be able to move forward from there. So it's really your choice, right? If you want to essentially encourage it to green back up, and we can chat a bit more about the watering schedule, or we can essentially take a pause and then follow up once the temps start to drop. So great question.
And that's something that we try to stress a good bit too, is that if your grass is stressed, we really don't want to be adding a whole bunch of stuff to it. You know, the first thing to go to, a lot of people do, is they increase the watering a ton, or they add a whole bunch of fertilizer. But if the grass is stressed, or if it's going dormant or something like that, it's only going to cause more issues later. Just making sure we kind of step back, we kind of take stock of what's going on, and then slowly try to repair it. You know, it's just like taking 5 different medications. If you have a cold, like, it's not going to really help. It might hurt you in the long run. So just making sure that we keep it slow, we kind of see what's going on, and try to slowly rehabilitate the grass instead of just throwing everything at it and seeing what sticks.
And we did have a question from Gibraltar asking, there's a bare spot which was seeded about 6 weeks ago and still don't see any baby grass yet. Been watering at least 10 minutes. Any recommendations? So this is a great question. And it will vary based on your grass type, right? So for example, if you have a rye, like a mix with a bit of rye, I would expect that to germinate a little bit quicker, right? Versus if we had a Bermuda grass or even centipede or zoysia, it might take a little bit longer for that seed to germinate. So 6 weeks, what would you say, Ivana? That sounds a bit long to me to not see any signs of grass. So my recommendation, will be including our email at the end of the webinar, webinars@getsunday.com. Please feel free to follow up with us with pictures, grass type, location, and we can certainly discuss this in more detail. But we could chat about essentially the temp range to make sure that everything's fine there, prepping the soil, and from a watering schedule, looking to maintain that moist environment. So as you know, typically watering at least every day or so. So overall, I would say, yeah, there could be a number of factors, but I would say those 3 general conditions tend to be where we start.
And Will, I am so excited about our next question from Hunter. Hunter, I know you don't know my lawn. If you did, be a little creepy, but I have the exact same situation out in my front yard. I've got 2 massive live oak trees. I've got St. Augustine is my entire thing. And the best way to go about it, honestly, is just to top dress it in the fall and spring when it's nice and cool. So that would just mean grabbing some topsoil or compost. I use a 50-50 mix, and I'm pretty lazy about it. So I just dump, bags or wheelbarrow onto my lawn and then gently rake it in. If you have a lot of long runners, then I would pull those into those bare areas and pin them. I wouldn't cut them unless you have to, just because it makes it a little bit harder. So just kind of promoting the growth in that area. Since St. Augustine doesn't have any seed and we can't overseed it, we would just try to keep that grass really healthy and moving it slowly into those areas. If you've got a very thick area, maybe in your backyard, you could decide to just take a chunk of it, take some plugs of it, and bring them out into the front. But I would check for your soil first. So if you want to like stick a screwdriver down into the soil, if it's very hard, if you're meeting resistance, then I would recommend aerating first. Clay soils are very difficult. I'm assuming you're in Texas just because of Live Oaks and St. Augustine. If you're not, it might still be a clay soil. So just checking your soil first. If it's something that it seems like is stunting the grass from being able to move, then aerating and top dressing. If it seems fine, then just the top dressing and encouraging that growth. Also cutting it a little bit high too will also help. I cut my St. Augustine at 3.5 inches, and it's looking real happy right now.
So Ivana, I know this is going to be one of your favorites, bindweed. And specifically for growing out in Utah.
Yes, so bindweed is one that is a very difficult weed to treat. It is something that our herbicides don't cover. It takes over very quickly. That is something I usually recommend just hand pulling as soon as you see it. But again, if it's something that's already starting to take over, something like that, I usually just recommend reaching out to your local extension, a lot of time your agriculture extension, because they do sometimes offer services to help invasive plant mitigation. I know some areas in Florida, they actually have a team come out and help you out with that. We can chat more about it if you want to send in some pictures to our webinars email. I can get you in touch with your extension service, or we can chat a little bit more about how to get rid of those. But bindweed is super hard to get rid of, unfortunately. And typically I just resort to hand pulling because it's the fastest way to get it out of there. Same thing for milkweeds, though I usually kind of leave them for the butterflies, but they are kind of a nuisance. So again, hand pulling is usually what I recommend there.
All right, and Chris from Southeast Florida, Empire Zoysia, great question. When to seed? So ideally, I would say we're really looking at late spring, early summer. So for the majority of areas in the country, right? Trying to make sure we give that zoysia enough time to germinate, typically at least a couple of weeks or so, and then really at least several more weeks to really establish from that seed, right? But complicating factor here is Florida, right? So we have a bit more flexibility. So that's, I would say, you know, it's going to be a bit easier for us to work into seeding. For your location, still, I'd be looking at, what would you say, Yvonne? I mean, right around the same recommendations for Bermuda or so, right? So I'd say from a soil temp perspective, upper 60s or so, daytime temps, upper 70s, low 80s or so would be ideal.
And something to note with zoysia seed is that it is a more slow growing seed. So that's something that won't germinate as quickly. You know, if your neighbor throws down a different seed blend, you might start to see a lot more germination there. Typically zoysia is pretty slow. So make sure to give it a good amount of time. Make sure to keep on top of the watering, and that should help. And Albin, that's a great question. So in Houston, I usually recommend just doing kind of what I mentioned with the St. Augustine, just encouraging the zoysia to spread. But overseeding is always a great option too. This is something I would only do in the spring just to make sure it has enough time to wait out the winter. But overseeding is just when you basically broadcast seed over your existing lawn. So if you see that lawn in the picture, it would just be using your seed spreader, going over the existing grass, maybe adding a little bit of topsoil or compost just to aid in germination. And then that is just overseeding, putting seed over your existing grass to encourage thickness and health and everything like that.
All right, and Ivana, hey, you're going to be a popular person after this. So she's our weed expert, our Texan and our Arizona. So we have Paul from Phoenix and weeds throughout Bermuda grass. So in general, I would say we do not offer a blanket herbicide, right? So if you were looking more for like a typical weed and feed, for example, or something you could apply across the entire lawn, there isn't anything from us. We can certainly chat a bit more about how we would best approach this, right? Specifically looking to make sure how can we modify the environment or minimize the chance of these weeds continuing to be an issue. However, with Phoenix, certainly a bit more extreme with our temps in the environment we're working with, right? Ivana, do you have any tips for specific weeds to keep an eye out for, or where to begin? Or
I do. I did have a lawn in Phoenix for a while. And the thing I think we battled the most was spurge. So the hard part about Phoenix is that, you know, it gets so hot. and the soil isn't really used to having a lot of water. So usually we recommend, especially for Bermuda grass, deep and infrequent watering, but it's a lot harder in Arizona because the soil doesn't really respond to that. So I'd recommend, especially to cut down on weed growth, would be to try to aerate this fall or in spring, whichever. Add just a little bit of topsoil again, and then just that will help modify the soil, help it retain a little bit more water. And I would also recommend cycle soaking. So this is just the practice of, let's say you have your sprinklers go for 30 minutes. Instead of that, I would do 5 minutes on, off, and then 5 minutes off, and then 5 minutes on, so on and so forth. And that just allows the ground to take up more water. I would try to keep the waterings as infrequent as possible, something like 2 times a week, and then once temperatures get above 85, 3 times a week. But mostly that infrequent watering schedule won't just be really healthy for the Bermuda grass, but most weeds in Arizona have very shallow root systems because they're responding to a lot of drip irrigation and shallow frequent waterings. So something like a spurge, one is very easy to hand pull. Just make sure to wear gloves because the sap can be reactive to your skin. But other things like that, I'm trying to think of other weeds I saw there. There weren't a lot. Mostly it was like tree saplings. So for those, I recommend hand pulling once they're small. If they get a little bigger, frequent mowing is really the only way to get rid of tree saplings since they're going to be stronger than basically everything else. So you'd have to use a very strong herbicide to get rid of those.
All right, Carolyn, great question. So this is, so Carolyn asked essentially, we have weed control and seeds, right? The lawn primarily consists of weeds right now. What should we do? And that's a great question, right? And so I will say that this is really a time where if the lawn is primarily weeds, I would really use this time to essentially pause and determine the best path forward. So what I mean by that is identifying why we're at or in this position with the lawn, right? For the weeds to be such a significant or take up such a significant portion of the lawn, right? We want to make sure that we're addressing why that is. So our order of operations webinar is a great starting point, but I would strongly recommend touching base with us offline at the webinars at getsunday.com email address. So just so we can take a look at pictures, we can chat through essentially what we would consider from a soil perspective, if we want to chat about soil compaction, watering schedule, mowing height, if it would be beneficial to top dress, when to look to seed, and everything there. So ideally, I would say we'd look to remove the weeds first, right? We'd then look to get some grass seed down and then continue with the nutrient pouches. But where we're at right now, we can certainly tweak that as needed, right? But I would say the first step here would be to essentially pause and come up with a plan, not just for this season, but also heading into next year.
And Jason, that's a great question. It has been raining quite a bit here in Texas as well, very frequently. So when trying to mow, we always recommend mowing dry grass, not wet grass. So if you can, wait for a break in the weather, even if it is midday or something like that, once it gets dried out. If not, I would just mow in the morning at least, just so that it can dry a little bit before heading into night, because we just want to mitigate any sort of fungal concerns there. And that also goes for Luis as well, asking about record-breaking heat and watering, things like that. I would still recommend watering in the morning because a lot of lawns in Central Texas are recovering from that rainy time. There might still be some fungal issues lying around. So just make sure water in the morning, Luis. I would say if you can, 4 to 5 in the morning. If you can't, I would say 6 to 7, maybe even 8 would be just fine. If you have things that can shade your lawn, if you've got lawn chairs or something, and there's some like hot spots in your lawn, putting those over them would be helpful. But mostly it'll just be down to watering well, very deeply. Make sure that, you're checking your soil after your water to see if it's gotten down a good bit, just to make sure that that grass is, taking up everything, and just mitigating stress. So not applying pouches when it's super hot outside. I wouldn't apply a pouch until temperatures get back down into the upper 90s.
And Chris, great question. Lots of weeds in the lawn at this point. Feel like we're maintaining weeds more than the grass. So at what point do we essentially consider starting over, starting from scratch with the lawn, right? And so I will say that the majority, I always try to exercise patience, right? And so the reason I say this is if we go sort of to the extreme and say, you know what, we're going to remove everything that's there and try to start from scratch. There are certainly situations where we can discuss that and it may be worth considering, but We just want to be careful with what we're using to get to that point, right? If we're leaving bare soil for a number of months immediately afterwards, right, because we just removed everything, we could just be essentially kicking the can down the road, if you will, right? So I wouldn't say there's a specific percentage that we look at per se, right? I would say once we get to the majority of the lawn being weeds, that's when we can chat a bit more about the situation. So again, I'd recommend feel free sending pictures into us and we can chat a bit more. But I would say I wouldn't give up hope yet and feel like we need to start completely from scratch, right? If anything, again, identifying why the weeds are such a significant factor. And then we can essentially try to start tackling this in chunks, right? And make sure that we're essentially building for long-term success, even if it takes a little bit longer for us to get there.
And I just want to remind everybody, if you can direct your questions over to the question and answer box, it's just a lot easier to categorize everything, to look at everything, and it's a lot easier for us to respond that way. So just make sure when you're submitting a question, if you could just use the question and answer box, that'd be very helpful. And then I see we have a question from Washington State, and they got a lot of moss, and that is a fantastic question. So moss thrives on a few different things, mainly being shade, moisture, and acidic soil. So I would say if you can't change how much sun that area is getting, I would try to mitigate the moisture. I know right now it should be a little bit drier in Washington State, but if it's still being an issue, if you can cut back on any watering that you're doing, that would be fantastic. But I think the main thing will probably be to mitigate the acidic soil. So doing things like a lime top dress would be really helpful. Soil takes a very long time to change. It's something that will not change with just one application. So especially in that area, even if it is just one area giving you grief, just top dressing that area with some lime once a year or so, you should start to see it decline. But yeah, it can be kind of an issue. I've seen it kind of take over some grass. So shade, water, acidic soil, that's going to be the main factors for moss growth.
All right, John, great question. Related to watering frequency, how does this impact essentially when to apply treatments? So let's see. So this is a really good question, right? And I'll say that, you know, this question has been coming up more frequently in areas of the country which we wouldn't necessarily expect, right? So here, this will be my moment to be able to use one of my favorite charts. So give me a moment. So this is from the beginning of June, but just paints a really good picture, right? So if we're looking at this as any areas which are in red, right, they're receiving much less natural precipitation than is normal for this time of year, whereas areas with more purplish hue, much more than normal. So what we're seeing is more of the gold or going gold factor for anywhere in the red, whereas with purple, we might be running into more disease or fungal concerns, right? So to your point, if we're on either extreme of those, right? Whether it's lack of water, too much water, excessive heat, then we just want to be mindful of when we're looking to apply these nutrient pouches. So when doing so, my focus is, my plan page is always a great starting point, right, to provide those recommended application dates. However, as long as we're able to get these pouches down over the course of the season, I'm happy, right? If we reach that desired nitrogen load at the end of the year, that's what I'm focused on. Right? Ideally, we'd apply them during these set timeframes, but I would not apply them if the grass is currently stressed. So the way that I look at this, there are three factors I consider. So the final one, but potentially the more frequent that we chat about, is from a temp range perspective, right? So we'd be looking to apply the pouches between 50 to 85 degrees. So in theory, if the grass is healthy, then we could work around that restriction as long as it's cooler in the morning, for example. So we could apply the pouch in the morning when it doesn't reach above 85, the daytime high is going to be above that. To your point, however, I want to make sure that essentially the grass is going to be able to benefit from the application. So if you're starting to see any signs of stress, which brings us to our next slide. We wanted, so brown patches, yellow patches, bare patches, any changes within the lawn could be changing the temps, changing the amount of precipitation, potentially the sprinkler system, right? We could be chatting about disease, pest, heat stress, right? There are a number of factors which, yes, we could look at it and believe that it could be heat or drought stress, right? And we know that we don't want to apply a pouch under those conditions, but there's certainly a number of other factors which can look similar. So I know I'm starting to ramble a bit here with this one, but this is a really good question. If the grass looks healthy, we can consider the application, but if you're ever in doubt, I strongly recommend reaching out to us and we can chat just about current conditions and making sure that the pouch is going to be beneficial.
And I see Mark has a question about leveling your ground without killing your grass. And unfortunately, the best answer is just to do it gradually. So I'm working with that right now. There's some uneven areas. So just usually when temperatures are cooler, so I would start doing this in the fall. Unless you have Bermuda grass, it can handle a little bit more temperatures. So you could do it, I would say, once the highs are in the 90s for Bermuda. Everything else, I would wait till it's a little bit lower. But just gradually putting a thin layer of topsoil in that area, allowing the grass to grow through it, and then just adding another layer. I would say during the growing season, you could do this every 2 weeks. It should grow through it just fine. But if you notice it's taking a little bit longer to grow through a layer, I would hold off on that application and do it the next week once you start to see more growth. To do it without killing the grass, we just want to make sure that it's not going to get smothered. So just maybe even cutting your grass just a little bit longer. So that way, when you put the soil over it, it can peek out just a little bit more, and then just gradually adding to it until it's level with the rest of the lawn.
All right, and Don, I live in a wooded area and have a significant amount of shade, seeded with Shade Select. Grass is doing well, but wanting to know if the grass will spread. So great question. So, yeah, this is specifically with grass types, where I would say the majority of cool season grasses aren't going to spread like we would expect a warm season grass to, right? Exception there is bluegrass, but so our Shade Select mix is primarily a fine fescue mix, which would benefit from essentially continuing to seed that area each year. So that is something where I would essentially just try to continue to tackle this in sections and continue to thicken it up, if you will.
And Hunter, that is a great question. Mowing and spreading the clippings in that area will help from a soil fertility perspective. It'll help that area be more hospitable to that St. Augustine you're trying to move into there. But since it is chopping up the grass so much, it won't really help from bringing new grass into root. So again, just trying to get the rest of the grass around there to spread over that area.
All right. Sod was placed in the yard after utility services had to dig up the parkway, but now knotweed has taken hold in the area. Is this an indication I should plug the yard this fall? Great question. So, Ivana, again, I'm going to defer to you with weed questions, but short answer for me, because I have to get my thought in here. Yes, I would look to get some grass reestablished in the area, but Ivana.
Yeah, knotweed is definitely one of those opportunist weeds. So that is something that probably just got dredged up once they moved the soil around. So your main focus would just be trying to pull it if you can. I believe it's listed on one of our labels, but I'm not going to say for sure because I can't remember. So I will follow up with you after the webinar and we can chat about knotweed there. I can check, different methods of removal, but again, hand pulling is usually going to be the best option for it or even if you don't have a lot of grass there. Mowing that area very short if you're going to plan to plug that area, because mowing a lot of weeds is very harmful for them versus grass not really caring too much.
All right, Abdul, great question. Dislike Bermuda grass mixed in tall fescue. I hear you. So grew up near Buffalo, so tall fescue is the best grass of all. But to your point, Bermuda is certainly going to love areas which don't receive quite as much water, quite as much or receive a bit more sunlight, right? So especially during the summer months. So it's very difficult to remove Bermuda from a cool season grass, right? And so what we would look to do is we can certainly chat about herbicides, right? I would say we're going to be getting into some pretty strong herbicides to get to that point, right? Bermuda is pretty tolerant of the majority of herbicides. So this is really a focus of, again, making sure that we are trying to maximize make the environment as optimal for the fescue as possible. So during the summertime, yes, it's going to be somewhat difficult, but maintaining that taller mowing height, if you will, right? Try to, the won't necessarily shade all that much, right? But just to help try to provide a little bit of a canopy, deep and infrequent watering schedule, but most likely going to need a bit more water than that Bermuda, right? And really making sure we're in a good position both in the spring and the fall. So if there are any thinner areas where the Bermuda or thinner areas available for the Bermuda to take hold, it's going to in the summer months, right? Once the fescue starts to struggle. So really prioritize the fescue's health, and then we could consider essentially just trying to dig out or target the Bermuda, but certainly not an easy solution, unfortunately.
And if it's coming from like a neighbor's yard or something like that, if your neighbor has Bermuda grass, then I would recommend something that usually people do for landscaping, which is just getting those metal borders that go down a few inches into the soil. Since Bermuda actually uses underground rhizomes as well as above ground runners, that will help also stop the spread if it's coming from a specific area. Just using that metal sheet, and usually you can just hammer it down a little bit into the soil as like a nice little border. And that will help things like Bermuda. If your neighbor has bamboo, that'll help with bamboo too. So anything like that that spreads underground, that will help stop the spread as well. And Nancy, I see that you tried the dandelion doom on the dollar weeds and you live in Houston. Dollar weed is a very hard thing to get rid of in Houston. It's something that resists a lot of herbicides, ones like ours specifically. For this, I would just try to mitigate any sort of watering. So I know down there it's very humid, and I know we've gotten a good bit of rain recently. So I would hold off on any supplemental waterings for now until these thunderstorms pass. You really only want your grass to be watered twice a week right now. So, you know, I think you guys got the same rain we did last night. If you did, I would hold off on watering probably until Sunday. And if there's more rain between then, I would hold off even longer. It really likes moisture, so just mitigating how much moisture goes into your lawn. It's also typically pretty easy to hand pull because it all grows on the same vine basically. So if you pull one up, the rest of it should come up too. I usually just pull it up in my lawn. And Brad, that's a great question. So peat moss is a good thing to use for top dressing in Texas since you have that clay. Since peat moss is acidic and it has a good bit of organic matter, that will help. Our only concern is that sometimes when people buy peat moss for their lawn, it can come with weed seeds in it. So usually I recommend any type of top dressing to be a bagged soil, so like a top soil or a compost, just because it's typically weed free. But if you would rather just use the peat moss, you know, if it's a really good deal, or if you do need that acidification, you know, it's still a great option too.
All right, and Peter, Atlanta, Georgia, with seeded zoysia on June 13th, when to start treatment. So great question. And so this will apply to also just general pouch application questions, right? So bare minimum, we're looking at least allowing 7 to 10 days or so between different pouch applications, right? So for example, returning to the question about the lawn going, allowing the lawn to go gold, right? Or if we want to hold on to pouch applications, if assuming the worst, right? If we were to hold on to all the pouches until the fall and incorporate them, then we'd have to be careful, make sure we're not putting too much down at one time or too close to the end of the season. But in general, we're looking at, as long as we allow that 7 to 10 day window or so, we'll be able to minimize the risk of over fertilization. So Peter, my focus is really making sure, just as you noted, allow that seed to germinate, allow the grass to establish a bit, right? Just to make sure it's essentially best able to benefit from the pouch application. And I'm not concerned about pushing these applications out a little bit, right? Just to make sure that the grass is best able to benefit from it. If the majority of the lawn is established right now, though, right, then it's really a toss-up, right? We could consider applying the pouches now so that the existing grass is able to benefit from it, or we can wait for the seeded areas to take hold. So really good question.
And Chris, that's also a fantastic question. Nutsedge and crabgrass are very difficult to remove. They do indicate usually that there is a good bit of water getting to your lawn. So again, a deep and infrequent watering schedule will keep them from persisting. But honestly, for those two, I found the best ways are to mow it and bag the clippings. If you mow nutsedge very frequently, that will exhaust the bulblets in the soil, very similar to the wild violet. And that will help it. It doesn't really like getting mowed since it has more of a whorled, which means it comes from the center. It has more of a whorled growth habit. It's a lot harder for it to recover after a mow. And crabgrass is a lot happier when you get that frequent watering, and it really likes having that open canopy where the crown of the plant, the very base of the plant is. So keeping your grass just a little bit higher. So if you have a zoysia right now where you're mowing at like a 2, I would go up to a 3 or something like that. And again, the crabgrass can be relatively easy to hand pull. If it's giving you problems, you could try our Weed Warrior on it. You just know that it might damage the turf grass in the area. So I'd only use that if you're planning on either reseeding the zoysia or planning on getting it to fill in that area with the runners.
And Brian from Sacramento, ideal watering schedule for a tall fescue lawn. And so this will apply really to both cool season grasses and warm season grasses, really making sure that we're following a deep and infrequent watering schedule, right? And so in the majority of situations, it's very rare for us to bump up to any more frequent than 3 days per week, right? And we would say, I mean, even what would you say, even in Phoenix, we're really looking at trying to stay to 3 as much as possible, right? During the summer heat. So my focus here with the fescue, looking to put down about 1/2 inch per session or so we can set up or complete an audit of the sprinkler system, set up tuna cans or sprinkler gauges throughout the lawn, measure how much water is put down. And then from there, we can even dig into the soil to see how deep that moisture is reaching, right? If we're getting down to a depth of at least 4 to 6 inches or so. And then from there, we can wait for the grass to start to show signs of needing a bit more water, right? So the blade's starting to fold or the blade's not necessarily bouncing back up when walking across them. But I would say for a fescue lawn, typically looking at probably, what we say for Sacramento, we're probably average is going to be right around 2 per week, I'd expect, and getting up to 3 during the summertime.
Yeah. 2 per week is usually my baseline. If you haven't figured out the best way to water your lawn, or if you don't know, really move to a new area and you're unfamiliar with the area, I just recommend starting at 2. And if it starts to stay a little bit too moist, if you're noticing a lot of dew on your grass versus other people's in the morning, cutting back down to 1, or if you start to notice that your grass is starting to go gold, or if you've seen that picture, those footprints in the lawn, then going up to 3.
All right, John, my lawn is on a slant. It rains often here, roads, someone washes the seed away. Great question. Yeah, so our biggest focus here, and so one of the factors when seeding is trying to make sure we get at least some cover there, right? To help try to keep that seed in place. So we could chat about topsoil. We could certainly chat about straw and versus hay, just making sure we're not picking it up from the roadside and potentially introducing some weed seeds, but we can at least get some cover there to help keep the seed in place. That can be a great option. And depending on where you're located, what are your thoughts on sometimes having a little bit of rye in the mix, just to have something that germinates a little bit quicker to help keep them in place? But any other suggestions?
Yeah, I was definitely going to suggest a rye. A lot of times it's in the cheaper seed mixes because it germinates so quickly. The only downside is that it also dies quickly. So a lot of people will seed with it, and then next year they'll be like, why is my lawn dying? And it's because that rye is typically very short-lived, but it's live fast, die young, basically. So you could do something like that just to get cover and then reseed over that with the stronger grass. You can also do what I've seen a lot of people do. They'll grab a very fine mesh to put over that area, and you can just keep it down with some bricks or pavers or something like that, some garden stakes, just to keep that area from going anywhere, basically. It'll keep the seed where it's supposed to be. So you could, combine both those methods and then reseed again with a stronger grass after. You could just try one or the other and see how your results go there. And Tony, I see your question about watering at night and fungal growth. It can. This is something that I usually do better safe than sorry on. So especially in areas that are very wet, very humid, that kind of thing. Watering at night allows the water to sit on the grass blades for a lot longer than during the day, because that gives it time to evaporate. And water on the leaves is usually the first thing that helps the fungus spread. So I would say if you're anywhere, kind of east, I would err on the side of caution, water in the morning. West tends to stay very dry. So somewhere like a Colorado or Arizona, I'm not as worried about fungal growth. So if you're in somewhere like that, I think you can get away with evening waterings. But somewhere where it's a little bit more humid, I always recommend watering in the morning just in case.
And we'll add in there too. So we just got out of a meeting with the head of our science team, Dr. Frank Rossi, also my alma mater, and I was chatting about how beautiful this spring has been, having the nice warm weather and not having too many rainy days, so I can get out fishing and out in the lawn. But he did say that we're expecting for a good portion of the Northeast, especially, we're going to see some pretty cool wet conditions, or a little bit warmer, but still a good amount of moisture, natural precipitation over the coming weeks. So what that means is we could be starting to see potential disease concerns or blooms take hold in areas where we wouldn't necessarily, I won't say that we wouldn't necessarily expect it, right? But potentially a little bit of an abnormal time, right? We got through the spring where we would expect it to be a little bit cooler and a little bit more moist. And now we're seeing more so heading into the extreme summer months. So keep an eye out, depending on where you're at. We may start to have to just be a bit more careful, even so, with the watering schedule. All right, and Brad, concerned about grubs, grub control since you've had them in prior years in Boston. Great question. So Sunday, there is a product available on our website, but it's currently sold out called Grub Gone. You can purchase it elsewhere, and that is my recommendation for a product, great product, just from both the as a preventive measure, right, and as more of a curative measure, if you will, right? So our biggest focus with grubs and with the majority of turfgrass pests are essentially maintaining a nice, thick, healthy turf, right? If we can minimize sparse areas, especially for grubs or beetles, which are laying their eggs primarily in thinner areas of turf, right? If we're able to maintain that thick grass and essentially minimize other stressors, we should be able to mitigate any grub pressure, right? So if you would like to apply a grub product, Grub Gone would be the product I'd take a look at, but also just keep an eye out. If grubs have been in the lawn previously, I'd specifically keep an eye on those areas. And if you start to notice just the grass starting to turn yellow, the grass no longer being well rooted, that's always a great sign to go essentially tug on the grass a bit and see if you see any signs of grubs.
I see we have a question from Basa Veswara to use cow manure over Bermuda. That is a great idea, though it can burn since cow manure is so high in nitrogen. I would highly recommend just cutting it in half with some regular topsoil, just a bag you can get from a Lowe's or Home Depot, just so we can mitigate any burn. Those things are very, very high in nitrogen, which can be a great thing, but we do just want to keep in mind that it's pretty warm outside. Grass can be, easily burned, especially if you're applying high loads of something organic. So I would just say mix it half and half with some topsoil, and that should be just fine.
Deborah from Texas. Can't remove enough weeds to get to the point to be able to seed or to fertilize. Sporadic rain and extreme heat. Yeah, so this, like we said at the beginning, right? This spring, especially potentially heading into the summer, it's been a very difficult period of time for the majority of the country, right? And so my recommendation here, please send in pictures once we get off the call here to us, just so we can essentially determine what is the best path, right? We can essentially just start tackling this in sections, get to the point where we're able to start moving forward, even if it's not necessarily where we want to be at this point in the season, right? If we're in a better position heading into next year, be sure that we're setting your lawn up for success. That's my focus. So please follow up with us and we'll be able to go from there.
I see Martha living in San Antonio, asking about recommendations what to deal with fungus. Yeah, we do have all that rain, and I do also have a fungus on my lawn. Typically with the fungal issues that we see in these areas, they don't typically need a fungicide unless they're very, very bad and persisting over a number of years. For right now, we really just want to make sure that we're letting the grass dry out between waterings if we can. If it's still raining, just kind of waiting it out. Right now, my lawn has gray spot, which is a very common fungus on St. Augustine. So right now, I'm just kind of letting it grow out a little bit. I'm letting it actually grow longer than usual. So when I cut it and bag the clippings to prevent the fungal spores from moving around, that way I'm just cutting a lot of the fungal diseased areas off of the grass. It'll start to recover here pretty soon. I haven't really had a lot of issues with it. So just kind of doing some maintenance will help it go away. If you do really want a recommendation for a fungicide, I would reach out to our local extension. So Texas A&M is the ag extension for Texas. So they should have some pretty good recommendations on fungicides if you like. But again, a lot of the fungal issues that we're seeing in Texas right now will start to go away here pretty quickly.
Perfect. And Julie, from Southern California, St. Augustine grass during the summer, lots of runners sitting on top of the lawn. Yeah, great question. So in all honesty, it makes part of the reason why St. Augustine is probably my favorite warm season grass, right? Since it does spread pretty quickly. So I'd be interested, Ivana, feel free to jump in here too, right? But if we're looking more so from just a runner perspective, right? I'm not necessarily opposed to maintaining that spread, but if we're starting to have more about thatch buildup, right, or essentially that layer in between the grass and the soil, that's when we could certainly take a look at that, right? That can be a buildup of essentially applying too much nitrogen, right? St. Augustine does tend to be a bit more, produce a bit more thatch, right? So we have to keep an eye on that. But yeah, Ivana, St. Augustine. Yeah.
It could be due to lack of regular watering. If you guys are going through a drought, it might just be trying to spread somewhere where there's a lot more water. But typically it's sending out runners is more a good thing than not. So it's not something I would really worry about. If you are worried about like it putting too much energy into the runners, this can also be a sign that you're mowing a little short, because mowing very short, not prevents, the other word, encourages a lot more lateral growth. So if you're mowing very short, it'll send out a lot more runners. So if you want to try mowing just a little bit higher, supplementing with just a little bit more water if you can, it should help with that runner issue.
And Victor from Seattle bought the house in January. Congrats. But lawn was in bad shape, overrun with weeds, overseeded or seeded after spot treating the weeds, and saw more weeds come back than new grass. So great question. So again, this is where I would really try to exercise patience, right? The default, or perhaps the tempting option, is to say, you know what, we're going to try to remove all the weeds right now, or we're going to try to essentially wipe everything out and start from a cleaner slate, right? So one of the questions we'll receive is, would I be able to apply a blanket herbicide, right? Or would I be able to apply something across the entire lawn? My biggest concern with applying something to a large area like this is if we're starting to run into a pre-emergent, right, which would actually inhibit seed germination for a period of time, so which would then prevent us from seeding. So my focus here would be to try to tackle this in sections. So if we're able to start whittling down the amount of weeds and get more and more grass established each year, that would be my focus. We could see it in the spring and the fall. But if there are specific weeds or specific sections, that is certainly where I would take a little bit more of an aggressive approach and determine, okay, are these weeds essentially a sign of a specific condition, right? Or unfortunately, when seeding, that's also the ideal time for weed seeds to germinate as well, right?
And Abdul, I absolutely love this question. I think it's a great way to think about getting Bermuda out of your lawn. The only issue is that Bermuda is a lot hardier than other grasses. So by doing that to burn the Bermuda, it would actually harm the fescue a lot more, unfortunately. Bermuda is a very, very hardy grass, and it is hard to get rid of sometimes. So that's usually why we recommend just, doing the border, pulling it out if you can, that kind of thing, adding in additional watering, because Bermuda doesn't like as much water as fescue. But I do like your thought process there. If it would work, I would be very happy.
All right, really great question. How to recover from snow mold. So yes, another very interesting winter for portions of the country, right? And so with snow mold, primary focus is trying to make sure if it's an area that has a bit worse drainage, right? So we could consider aerating if it's a compacted area from more of a long-term or preventive standpoint, right? But specifically trying to repair these areas or get the areas to recover, we essentially just try to scuff that area up a bit, add a bit of the nutrient pouch, essentially encourage that grass to grow. But worst case scenario, I'm always a proponent for essentially breaking up the area, getting that dead grass removed, right? Adding a bit of topsoil, putting some grass seed down, and then being able to move forward from there. So long term, make sure that we aren't running into any drainage concerns, but from the short term, I'd really look to try to seed the area. Certainly not the ideal time to do so right now, right? But there's still areas which need to be repaired. Fall would be a great time to touch those up. All right, and Morris, hey, great to hear from you. So Morris and I spoke a few weeks ago, so glad to hear the update. So essentially dealing with zoysia grass in the front lawn, which is showing some balding spots. in certain areas, new issue since he's been home for 20 years. And usually comes around during May, still have balding in one section and not sure what to do. So Morris, please feel free. I'll make a note to reach out to you once we get off the call here, and we can figure out if we want to hop on a phone call or take a look at pictures. But in general, with zoysia, biggest focus is, again, making sure that we modify the environment to make sure we're minimizing stressors. We can add a bit of topsoil and potentially look to cedar plug. And so I realize this is all a recap for you, but in general, that's typically our focus with zoysia. And then if there's a specific localized area which is still struggling, it's interesting if it's such a small area, right? And that's when we'd start to chat a bit more about, could it be something abnormal from the soil? Could it be, it would be odd for it to be pest pressure or a disease issue, right? For such a small area, but certainly worth considering. So look forward to connecting after the call here.
And I see George is back. I've seen you in a few of our webinars now. So hello again, George. And I think it's a great idea to grab some of that grass that you're taking out for that path and put it in other areas. I will say raking up a little bit is super helpful. I would just add a little bit of topsoil too, just because adding new soil is really, I know this is something I talk about constantly, but adding new soil is just really great because it's very fresh, it's very open textured, so it's a lot easier for the grass to root into. So just maybe remove a little bit of soil, rake up the stuff that's there, add a little bit of topsoil, and then spread your grass over it. And then just make sure with any sort of adding new grass like sod or plugs or grass from other areas in your lawn, do what's called floating. So instead of just giving it a little bit, of water at a time, kind of just make sure that you're watering until the grass floats up a little bit, let that drain, and then do that again once it's dried. And this will really help promote deep rooting, especially for new grasses and especially in warm areas.
And look at that, with less than a minute to spare. Perfect. Well, everybody, if there aren't any other questions, we'll go ahead and get this wrapped up. Thank you for attending here today. Like we said, keep an eye out for the follow-up survey. This is, like we said, this is the first time that we've done this sort of live Ask Us Anything. So if you did enjoy this, please leave a note in the survey for us. We'd be thrilled to do this again if interested. So appreciate you all being here. Truly appreciate the great participation as well. This was great to see. So look forward to seeing you at an additional webinar, and have a great rest of your day. Take care.
Take care, y'all. See you soon.